Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are certain truths that seem as immutable as the stars themselves. The Astronomicon burns eternal. The Emperor watches from the Golden Throne, and the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, remain forever loyal. But what if that final certainty, that bedrock foundation of imperial power, were to shatter? What if the Emperor's own golden guardians, those genetically perfect warriors who stand as humanity's ultimate protectors, were to turn their guardian spears against the very Imperium they were created to defend? This is not a question the Imperium permits its citizens to ask. To even contemplate such heresy would be to invite the attention of the Inquisition, to risk summary execution for thought crimes against the God Emperor. Yet in the quiet spaces between the stars, in the sealed chambers where forbidden knowledge is kept, there are those who understand that no loyalty is truly absolute. Everything has its breaking point, even bonds forged in the Emperor's own genetic laboratories. The Adeptus Custodes represent something beyond mere military might. They are living symbols of the Emperor's will, each one a masterwork of bioalchemy that took decades to create. Where Space Marines are mass-produced warriors, forged in batches of thousands, each custodian is individually crafted, their genetic code rewritten at the cellular level through processes that remain mysteries even to the most learned tech priests of Mars. They are not simply enhanced humans wearing golden armor. They are something else entirely, beings who exist in that liminal space between mortal and God, carrying within their very cells a fragment of the Emperor's own divine essence. To understand what would happen if the Custodians turned traitor, we must first understand what they truly are, and why their betrayal would represent not merely a military catastrophe, but an existential crisis that would shake the Imperium to its very foundations. The Golden Exemplars. The Adeptus Custodes predate almost everything else in the Imperium. They walked beside the Emperor during the Unification Wars, when Terra was still a shattered wasteland, ruled by techno-barbarian warlords, and the dream of a united humanity was just beginning to take form. They fought through the Great Crusade, witnessing the birth of the Imperium and the tragedy of the Horus Heresy. They have stood vigil over the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, their watch never wavering, their dedication never faltering. Each custodian begins their journey as an infant, selected from the noble families of Terra in a process shrouded in ancient ritual and secrecy. These children, plucked from their cradles before they can even speak, are taken to the hidden laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace, where gene wrights and bioalchemists begin the long, agonizing process of transformation. What follows is not the crude implantation of organs that creates a space marine. Instead, it is a complete rewriting of the subject's genetic code, a cellular restructuring that takes place over decades. The mortality rate is staggering. Of every 1,000 infants selected, perhaps one will survive to become a fully fledged custodian. The rest perish in the transformation chambers, their bodies unable to withstand the alchemical changes being wrought upon them, or their minds shattering under the psycho-conditioning that accompanies the physical alterations. Those who do survive emerge as something that barely resembles humanity anymore, standing a full head taller than even Space Marines, their reflexes impossibly quick, their strength capable of tearing apart armored vehicles with their bare hands. But it is not their physical prowess alone that sets the custodians apart. Each one is also a scholar, a philosopher, a diplomat. Where Space Marines are conditioned to think as soldiers, trained to function as part of a greater military machine, custodians are educated as individuals. They study history, art, philosophy, and statecraft. They are meant to be the Emperor's companions, capable of holding discourse with him on matters ranging from military strategy to the nature of consciousness itself. They were designed not merely to protect his physical form, but to be worthy of standing in his presence. Their equipment reflects this individual craftsmanship. Each suit of auramite armor is custom fitted to its wearer, forged from materials so rare that a single pauldron might be worth more than an entire regiment of Imperial Guard. Their weapons, whether guardian spears, sentinel blades, or the other exotic armaments in their arsenal, are works of art that took master artificers years to complete. The bullets in their bolters are handcrafted, each one inscribed with micro-etchings of protective wards. Nothing about the Custodians is mass-produced or standardized. Each is unique, irreplaceable. During the Great Crusade, the Custodians numbered approximately 10,000, a number they have maintained with remarkable consistency even into the 41st millennium. This number is not arbitrary. It represents the maximum force that can be sustained given the incredibly demanding creation process and the finite resources available even to the Imperium. To lose even a single Custodian is a tragedy that resonates through the halls of the Imperial Palace, marked by the tolling of the Bell of Lost Souls and mourned by the entire Brotherhood. Their organization reflects their nature as individuals. While they have ranks and command structures, these are more gestures of respect toward veterans than true military hierarchies. A shield captain leads not through the rigid discipline of the Astartes, but through earned authority and proven wisdom. The Captain General, the supreme commander of the Custodians, holds one of the most powerful positions in the entire Imperium, often sitting among the High Lords of Terror themselves. Yet even he cannot simply command his brothers as a general commands soldiers. He guides, he advises, he coordinates. But each Custodian retains a degree of autonomy that would be unthinkable in the regimented Space Marine legions. This individualism has sometimes been mistaken for a weakness. Observers, particularly Astartes, who have fought alongside Custodians, have noted that they do not display the same squad cohesion as Space Marines. They have been described as lions rather than wolves, each a solitary apex predator rather than a pack hunter. But this perception is misleading. When Custodians fight together, they do so with a coordination that comes not from drilled responses or predetermined tactics, but from a shared understanding so deep it borders on the telepathic. They fought in perfect synchronization during the war within the webway, thousands of them holding the line against demonic hordes for years. They have proven time and again that their individualism does not preclude cooperation. It simply manifests differently than in the more traditional military forces of the Imperium. Yet for all their might, for all their perfection, the Custodians are not invulnerable. They can be wounded, they can bleed, they can die. During the war within the webway, that desperate conflict that raged beneath the Imperial Palace while the Horus heresy consumed the galaxy above, the Custodians were reduced from 10,000 to barely 1,000. They fought against odds that would have broken any other force, facing greater demons, corrupted titans, and horrors beyond description. 2 of their 3 tribunes fell in that endless war. Ancient heroes whose names had been legendary were reduced to broken bodies, fed into the maws of dreadnought sarcophagi, their shattered forms encased in adamantium tombs so they could continue the fight. The psychological impact of that war on the surviving Custodians cannot be understated. For thousands of years afterward, they withdrew into the Imperial Palace, becoming increasingly isolated from the broader Imperium. They had fought beside the Emperor himself in the depths of the webway, watched him burn with psychic fire as he held back the demonic tide, witnessed his final confrontation with the demon Drachnien. Then they had watched him return to Terra mortally wounded, saw him interred upon the golden throne, his body reduced to a withered husk, kept alive only by archaeotech machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. That trauma, that sense of failure at being unable to protect their creator, drove the Custodians into a period of withdrawn grief that lasted millennia. They maintained their vigil over the Emperor's body. They defended the Imperial Palace with their usual lethal efficiency, but they largely ceased to engage with the wider Imperium. It was not until the return of Rabut Guilliman in the 41st millennium that this changed, when the newly reborn Primarch essentially shamed them into action, pointing out that the best way to protect the Emperor was to protect his Imperium, not to hide in the palace while it burned around them. This history reveals something crucial about the Custodians. Despite their genetic perfection, despite the psycho-conditioning and the bioalchemical alterations, they remain capable of emotion. They can feel grief, shame, determination, even doubt. They are not automata, not mindless servitors programmed with absolute loyalty. They are thinking, feeling beings who have chosen to dedicate their lives to the Emperor's service. And that choice, that element of free will, however constrained by genetics and conditioning, means that theoretically, under the right circumstances, they could choose differently. The unbreakable bond. To contemplate the Custodians turning traitor requires understanding the mechanisms that bind them to the Emperor. Bonds so deep they touch the very foundations of their being. These are not merely psychological or ideological commitments that might be swayed by argument or broken by trauma. The loyalty of the Custodians is woven into their genetic code, inscribed upon their souls, reinforced by every fiber of their transhuman existence. The gene crafting process that creates a Custodian does more than simply enhance physical capabilities. It fundamentally rewrites the subject's neurological architecture, creating neural pathways that make loyalty to the Emperor feel as natural and necessary as breathing. Unlike Space Marines, who receive gene seed derived from the Primarchs and can therefore potentially be swayed by corruption of that genetic legacy, Custodians are crafted using genetic material believed to come from the Emperor himself. They do not carry a Primarch's flaws or predispositions. They carry the Emperor's own genetic perfection, diluted but still potent. This genetic connection manifests in ways that border on the mystical. Custodians have reported feeling the Emperor's presence even when separated from him by vast distances. During the Great Crusade, those few Custodians who accompanied the Primarchs as the Emperor's eyes and ears spoke of being able to sense his will, to understand his intentions, without need for direct communication. This is not telepathy in the conventional sense, but something deeper. A resonance between creator and creation that operates on a level beyond conscious thought. The psycho-conditioning that accompanies the physical transformation reinforces this connection. For decades, as the young Custodian's body is being rebuilt cell by cell, their mind is being shaped with equal care. They are exposed to thousands of hours of subliminal programming, psychic imprinting, and mnemonic conditioning. They memorize the entirety of Imperial history, study tactical doctrine from every major campaign since the Unification Wars, learn dozens of languages and diplomatic protocols. But more than knowledge, they are instilled with purpose. This purpose is singular and absolute, to serve the Emperor. Not the Imperium, not humanity, not any abstract ideal, but the Emperor himself. A Custodian's loyalty is personal in a way that the loyalty of a Space Marine to his chapter is not. They were created to be his companions, his friends, his most trusted servants. They have spent time in his presence, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his regard. For a Custodian, serving the Emperor is not a duty imposed from without. It is the fulfillment of their fundamental nature, as natural and necessary as a star giving light. Yet even bonds this deep are not necessarily unbreakable. History provides examples, rare and disturbing, of Custodians who fell short of their absolute standard. During the Horus Heresy, a group of Custodians accompanied the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit for the final confrontation with Horus. Many of them died in that assault, cut down by traitor Astartes and demonic entities before they could reach the War Master's throne room. Those deaths were honorable, warriors falling in defense of their Emperor. But what of the few who survived to witness the Emperor's confrontation with Horus? What did they feel, watching their creator struck down, powerless to intervene? The records from that time are fragmented and contradictory, many of them deliberately obscured by later revisions and the passage of 10,000 years. But fragments remain, whispers of custodians whose faith was shaken not by corruption, but by the simple, devastating realization that the emperor could be harmed. If he could be wounded, if he could be brought low by one of his own sons, then what did that mean for his divinity? What did it mean for the custodian's purpose? There are also darker hints in the archives, carefully buried accounts that speak of custodians who questioned the emperor's methods during the Great Crusade. The emperor's stance on religion was absolute. Superstition and faith were to be eradicated, replaced by reason and science. Yet his methods for enforcing this imperial truth often involved the wholesale slaughter of populations who refused to abandon their gods. Entire cultures were annihilated, their histories erased, their art and literature burned. Some custodians, witnessing these purges firsthand, reportedly expressed discomfort with the brutality involved. These doubts never evolved into outright rebellion. The custodians' conditioning, their genetic loyalty, the sheer weight of their purpose, all combined to keep them on the emperor's path. But the fact that such questions could even be asked, that custodians could witness atrocities and feel moral uncertainty, suggests that their loyalty, while incredibly strong, is not metaphysically absolute. They are not demons bound by true names, not servitors with their capacity for independent thought lobotomized away. They are enhanced humans, and humans, no matter how genetically perfect, remain capable of doubt. The most significant test of custodian loyalty came during the war within the webway. For years, the custodians fought in conditions that would have broken any lesser force. They battled in dimensions where physics operated by alien rules, where time flowed differently, where the very ground beneath their feet was comprised of solidified psychic energy. They fought greater demons one-on-one, held choke points against tide after tide of howling warp entities, watched their brothers die in ways that defied description. The Emperor was with them for much of this conflict, fighting at their side, but even his presence could not prevent the slow grinding attrition that reduced their numbers from 10,000 to barely 1,000. In the depths of that war, according to fragmentary accounts preserved by the few survivors, some custodians began to despair. They had been created to be invincible, to be the Emperor's perfect defenders, yet they were being overwhelmed. They were dying, slowly but inexorably, and there seemed no end to the enemy's numbers. The webway itself was infinite, connected to the warp in ways that meant demonic reinforcements could arrive forever. No matter how many they killed, more would come. It was during this period that the Emperor made one of his most controversial decisions. He ordered the sealing of the webway gate, trapping any remaining Imperial forces beyond the seal to buy time for the evacuation of those closer to Terra. Thousands of Mechanicum workers, dozens of custodians, and uncounted other defenders were abandoned to their fates, sacrificed so that the core of the force could retreat. The custodians obeyed this order, as they obeyed all the Emperor's commands, but the accounts suggest that some did so with visible reluctance, even anguish. This willingness to sacrifice even his own custodians, to abandon them to death, or worse, for the sake of strategic necessity, revealed something about the Emperor that some of his guardians found deeply troubling. He was not a kind master. He was not even, perhaps, a particularly compassionate one. He was utterly focused on the long-term survival of humanity, willing to pay any price, make any sacrifice, to achieve that goal. For most custodians, this was acceptable, even admirable. But for a few, it planted seeds of doubt that would never quite die. Questions about whether their creator truly valued them as individuals or merely as useful tools. These seeds remained dormant for millennia. The custodians continued their vigil, their loyalty never wavering in any practical sense. But the capacity for doubt, once awakened, can never be entirely suppressed. And in the right circumstances, given sufficient pressure and the proper catalyst, even the most carefully conditioned loyalty can crack. The precipice of betrayal. For the custodians to turn against the Emperor would require something extraordinary. Not corruption in the traditional sense, not the whispering promises of the chaos gods, or the slow rot of heresy. The Custodians are essentially immune to such influences, their genetic purity and psychic fortitude forming barriers that even the greatest demons would struggle to breach. No, their betrayal would need to arise from within, from a fundamental philosophical break with the being they were created to serve. Consider one possible scenario: the revelation that the Emperor has been actively deceiving the Custodians about his true nature and intentions. What if evidence emerged, undeniable and irrefutable, that the Emperor had always intended to become a god, that his entire campaign against religion during the Great Crusade was not about freeing humanity from superstition, but about eliminating competing power sources in the warp, preparing the way for his own ascension to godhood? Such a revelation would strike at the very heart of what the Custodians believe they serve. For 10,000 years, the Custodians have been the guardians of the imperial truth. That fundamental doctrine stating that gods do not exist, that the Emperor is merely a supremely powerful human, that reason and science are humanity's salvation. They have witnessed countless billions worship the Emperor as divine, have watched the ecclesiarchy transform his secular vision into the most oppressive theocracy in galactic history, and through it all, they have maintained that the Emperor is not and never was a god. They insist on this not out of political convenience, but because they believe it to be truth. But what if documents were discovered, sealed away in some hidden vault, proving that the Emperor had secretly made pacts with the Chaos Gods? What if the Primarch project was revealed to be not merely tainted by chaos, but fundamentally dependent upon it, requiring the Emperor to bargain away parts of his own humanity to gain the knowledge needed to create his sons? Worse still, what if evidence emerged that the Emperor had foreseen the Horus heresy, had known from the beginning that Horus would fall, and had permitted it to occur because the resulting civil war would provide the massive psychic trauma and suffering needed to fuel his transformation into a warp entity? Such revelations would be devastating. The Custodians' entire purpose is built on the premise that they serve a being worthy of such absolute dedication. If that being was revealed to be not a noble protector of humanity, but a manipulative tyrant willing to sacrifice billions for personal power, would their genetic conditioning be enough to maintain their loyalty? Would they continue serving someone who had lied to them, used them, treated them as nothing more than pawns in a cosmic game they never agreed to play? Another scenario might involve the Emperor's current state. For 10,000 years, the Custodians have maintained their vigil over what is, objectively, a corpse. The Emperor's body has long since passed beyond any conventional definition of life. His physical form is a withered husk, his mind fractured and diffused across the Imperium, only barely tethered to the rotting flesh on the golden throne. The Custodians tell themselves that they protect the Emperor, but in truth, they protect a corpse that might once have contained the Emperor's consciousness. What if they came to believe that the Emperor they knew, the being they were created to serve, died during the confrontation with Horus? That what remains is merely a psychic echo, an automated defense mechanism left behind by a dead god, consuming 1,000 souls every day to maintain a beacon that serves only to prolong humanity's suffering? What if they concluded that the kindest thing, the most merciful act, would be to allow the Golden Throne to fail, to let the Emperor finally die completely, rather than persisting in this tortured half-existence? This possibility is particularly insidious, because it would be motivated not by hatred or corruption, but by compassion. The Custodians love the Emperor in a way that few others in the Imperium can truly understand. They knew him when he walked among them, fought beside him, heard his voice. To believe that he suffers, that his existence on the Golden Throne is nothing but endless agony, would be unbearable. If they came to believe that death would be mercy, that turning off the Golden Throne would end his torment, they might choose to betray the Imperium not out of malice, but out of love. A third potential catalyst could involve the return of the Primarchs. Robuta Guilliman has already returned, and with him has come significant changes to the Imperium's structure and doctrine. But what if others returned? What if Leman Russ emerged from the warp, or the lion awoke from his slumber in the rock? Or even lost Primarchs like Vulcan or Korax reappeared after millennia in the shadows? Each Primarch carries with them their own vision of what the Imperium should be, their own interpretation of the Emperor's will. If these returned Primarchs began to conflict with each other, began pulling the Imperium in different directions, the Custodians might be forced to choose between them, and in that choice might lie the seeds of rebellion. What if one Primarch convinced a faction of Custodians that the others had been corrupted, that the only way to save the Emperor's vision was to overthrow the current power structure? The Custodians have always served the Emperor directly, but with the Emperor unable to communicate clearly, they must interpret his will themselves. Different interpretations could lead to different factions, and from factional dispute could come civil war. Perhaps the most disturbing scenario would be if the Custodians simply lost faith, not in the Emperor specifically, but in the entire purpose of the Imperium. For 10,000 years they have watched humanity suffer under the most oppressive regime imaginable. They have seen the ecclesiarchy torture and burn billions in the name of an emperor who preached reason and enlightenment. They have witnessed the Inquisition's purges, the administratum's staggering incompetence, the endless wars that consume countless lives for no discernible gain. They have watched the dream the Emperor fought for become a nightmare. What if the Custodians came to believe that the Imperium cannot be saved? That it has become so corrupted, so far removed from its founding principles, that the only hope for humanity would be to tear it all down and start again? They might reason that the Emperor would have wanted them to protect humanity, not to protect the institutions that oppress humanity. In such a scenario, their rebellion would be framed as fulfilling the Emperor's true will, even as they moved to destroy the empire built in his name. The actual trigger for such a catastrophic shift in loyalty might be subtle. Perhaps a single Custodian, one with particular authority or respect among his brothers, reaches a conclusion that challenges the status quo. In the highly individualistic culture of the Custodians, where each warrior is encouraged to think for himself, where philosophical discourse and debate are valued skills, such ideas could spread through conversation and reasoned argument, rather than through military conspiracy. Unlike the Horus heresy, where the traitor legions were corrupted through years of carefully orchestrated manipulation by chaos, a Custodian rebellion might emerge through pure logic. A philosophical conclusion reached through impeccable reasoning, but based on premises that contradict 10,000 years of unwavering service. The very traits that make the Custodians superior warriors, their intelligence, their capacity for independent thought, their deep understanding of history and philosophy, these same traits could enable them to rationalize the unthinkable. Terror burns. The moment of betrayal would be sudden, shocking, and absolutely devastating. The Adeptus Custodes do not telegraph their intentions, do not engage in lengthy conspiracies or obvious preparations. When they move, they do so with the decisive speed and overwhelming force that has characterized their actions since the Unification Wars. One moment, the Imperial Palace stands as it has for 10 millennia, the most heavily fortified structure in the galaxy, its golden guardians maintaining their eternal watch. The next moment, everything changes. The first indication that something has gone catastrophically wrong would likely be the silence. The Custodians maintain constant communication with the broader Imperial apparatus, coordinating with the Imperial Fists, who share responsibility for defending the Sol System, liaising with the High Lords of Terror, updating various military and administrative organizations on the security status of the Throne World. When that communication suddenly ceases, when the Vox channels go dead, and even the most privileged astropaths find their messages to the palace going unanswered, the initial response would probably be confusion rather than alarm. But confusion would not last long. Within the Imperial Palace itself, within the vast structure that houses billions of adepts, scribes, servants, and officials. The Custodians' betrayal would manifest with terrifying speed. The palace is protected not just by the 10,000, but by hundreds of thousands of Imperial Guard regiments, massive defensive batteries, and some of the most sophisticated defense systems ever created.
I'll be honest with you. When I started researching this topic, I thought it would be straightforward. Custodians turn bad, galaxy burns, the end. But the more I dug into the lore, the more I realized how nuanced it actually is. Unlike Space Marines who can fall to chaos, the Custodians would have to make a completely rational choice to betray everything they stand for. And that's what keeps me up at night about this scenario. It's not about corruption or madness, it's about logic leading to an impossible conclusion. Anyways, back to the story.
Under normal circumstances, these forces would be coordinated by the Custodians, working together to present an impenetrable defense. Now, those same forces would find themselves facing the warriors they were meant to serve alongside. The Custodians know every defense, every protocol, every contingency plan. They help design most of them. They know which Vox frequencies the Imperial Guard use, where the ammunition depots are located, which power junctions feed the void shield generators. They know every single weakness in the palace's defenses because they have spent 10,000 years eliminating those weaknesses, and in the process, they have created a comprehensive map of how to exploit what remains. The slaughter would be systematic and horrifyingly efficient. Guardian spears would cut through hastily assembled defensive positions like scythes through grain. Auramite armor would shrug off lasfire and stub rounds as if they were gentle rain. Individual Custodians would carve through entire companies of Imperial Guard, not because the guardsmen lack courage or skill, but because the gulf in capability is simply too vast to bridge. A Custodian is to a guard as a guard is to a civilian. The fight would be as one-sided as a mechanized infantry division attacking medieval knights. The palace's automated defenses would fare little better. The machine spirits that control the defense turrets, the servitors that man the weapons batteries, all of them recognize Custodian command codes. Many would simply shut down when ordered to do so by warriors whose authority is absolute. Those that remained functional due to hard-coded restrictions or redundant protocols would find themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who know exactly where they are positioned, exactly what their firing arcs cover, exactly how to approach them from blind angles. Within hours, the Custodians would control the entire inner palace. The outer palace, that vast sprawl of administrative buildings and population centers that surrounds the Emperor's sanctum, would take longer to secure, but the outcome would never be in doubt. Millions of civilians would flee, creating a humanitarian catastrophe as they attempted to evacuate through spaceports that were never designed to handle such volumes. Those who could not escape would find themselves trapped in a war zone, caught between Custodian assault forces and whatever Imperial defenders could be cobbled together from the palace's remaining loyal forces. The symbolic importance of certain targets would become immediately apparent. The Eternity Gate, that mile-long approach to the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor resides, would become a focal point. The Custodians have guarded this gate for 10 millennia. The thought of them now storming it, turning their guardian spears against the very threshold they were created to protect, would strike at the heart of everything the Imperium believes about loyalty and duty. But the Eternity Gate is merely one objective among many. The High Lords of Terror, those 12 individuals who nominally govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, would become immediate targets. Most of them maintain residences within the palace complex. Those who survived the initial assault would find themselves hunted through the labyrinthine corridors by warriors who know every hiding place, every secret passage, every conceivable escape route. Some might survive through sheer luck, or by reaching secure locations designed to withstand even the worst catastrophes. But many would not. The death of the High Lords would create a power vacuum of staggering proportions. These individuals, for all their faults and political infighting, represent the central authority of the entire Imperium. They command the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the Administratum, the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition. Their deaths would leave these vast institutions leaderless at precisely the moment when coordinated leadership is most desperately needed. Meanwhile, in orbit above Terra, the Sol system's naval defenses would face an agonizing dilemma. Orbital bombardment of Terra is unthinkable. The throne world is sacred, home to countless holy sites and the physical body of the Emperor himself. Yet allowing the Custodians to control the Imperial Palace is equally unthinkable. The fleet commanders would find themselves paralyzed by impossible choices, unable to act decisively for fear of causing catastrophic damage to Terra's surface, or worse, to the Imperial Palace and the Golden Throne within it. This paralysis would give the Custodians time to secure their position. The palace's void shields, some of the most powerful defensive barriers ever constructed, would come fully online, rendering orbital bombardment even more difficult. The shields were designed to withstand sustained fire from entire battle fleets. Even if the Navy were willing to risk damage to Terra, breaking through those shields would require sustained bombardment that would take weeks, possibly months. During this time, the Custodians would not be idle. They would fortify their position, transforming the Imperial Palace from a defensive structure into an active fortress. The manufactories within the palace, capable of producing arms and armor of the highest quality, would begin churning out weapons and ammunition. The palace's internal population, billions of adepts and servants, would become either resources to be mobilized or problems to be managed, depending on their usefulness and loyalty. Some among this population would undoubtedly support the Custodians. There are many within the Imperial administration who have grown disillusioned with the current state of the Imperium, who see the endless bureaucratic nightmare, the religious oppression, the pointless wars and staggering incompetence, and yearn for change. If the Custodians presented their rebellion as a reformation rather than simple betrayal, they might find willing collaborators among those who believe the Imperium has strayed too far from the Emperor's original vision. Others would resist, would attempt sabotage, or simply refuse to cooperate. The Custodians would need to deal with these elements efficiently, but cannot afford to waste time on elaborate suppression efforts. The solution would likely be brutal and pragmatic. Resistance would be crushed with overwhelming force. Those deemed essential would be compelled to work, and the rest would be confined or expelled from the palace entirely. The most critical question during this initial phase would be the fate of the Emperor himself. The Custodians' betrayal means nothing if they leave the Emperor untouched. Still sustained by the Golden Throne, still able to direct the Astronomicon and maintain the seals keeping demonic forces at bay. Any meaningful rebellion would require the Custodians to take direct action regarding the Golden Throne. And here the possibilities become truly horrifying. If their goal is to end what they perceive as the Emperor's suffering, they might attempt to shut down the Golden Throne, allowing him to finally die. The consequences of this action would be catastrophic beyond measure. The Astronomicon would fail, plunging the Imperium into navigational darkness. The psychic seal holding back the demonic forces in the sealed webway gate beneath the palace would collapse, allowing horrors beyond counting to pour into real space. Terra itself might be consumed by a warp rift, transformed into a second eye of terror at the very heart of the Imperium. Alternatively, if their goal is to preserve the Emperor but reform the Imperium around him, they might attempt to strengthen the Golden Throne rather than destroy it. This would require massive resources and the cooperation of the Mechanicus, but if achieved, it could potentially stabilize the Emperor's condition, perhaps even allow him to communicate more clearly. This would give the Custodians something invaluable, the ability to claim they act with the Emperor's direct blessing, that unlike the High Lords who merely interpret his will, they have heard his actual voice. Regardless of their specific actions regarding the Emperor, the Custodians' control of both him and the Imperial Palace would give them leverage unlike anything the Imperium has faced since the Horus Heresy. They would not need to conquer the galaxy to reshape it. They would merely need to hold Terra and make credible threats about what they might do with their position. Every faction in the Imperium, from the Space Marines to the Inquisition to the Mechanicus, would have to carefully consider how they respond to rebels who literally hold a gun to the Emperor's head. The Imperium responds. News of the Custodians' betrayal would spread through the Imperium like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, each ripple carrying shockwaves of disbelief and horror. The initial reports would be dismissed as impossible, as garbled transmissions or enemy disinformation. The Adeptus Custodes turning traitor. The idea would seem more plausible if the report claimed the stars had begun falling from the sky. And yet, as more reports arrived, as astropathic messages painted an increasingly consistent picture of catastrophe on Terra, denial would give way to stunned acceptance. The Space Marine chapters would receive the news with varying degrees of reaction, but all would recognize it as an existential threat to the Imperium. The Custodians are held in nearly religious reverence by the Astartes, viewed as the perfect warriors, the Emperor's own companions, the standard against which all others measure themselves. To learn that these paragons have turned against the throne would shake the foundations of every chapter's beliefs about duty and loyalty. The Imperial fists would feel the blow most keenly. As the traditional defenders of the Sol system, they share responsibility for Terra's protection with the Custodians. Many Imperial fists serve on the Phalanx, the massive star fortress that maintains permanent orbit over Terra. From their vantage point in space, they would have watched helplessly as the Imperial Palace descended into chaos, unable to intervene without risking massive civilian casualties and damage to Holy Terra itself. The chapter's response would be immediate and absolute. Every Imperial fist who could be recalled would converge on the Sol system. Their fortifications expertise would be turned toward the problem of breaking into the most fortified structure in the galaxy, held by warriors whose defensive capabilities exceed even those of the Sons of Dawn. The irony would not be lost on anyone. Rogel Dawn had designed many of the palace's defenses during the Horus Heresy, and now his descendants would need to overcome those same defenses. The Ultramarines, ever pragmatic and systematic, would likely take a different approach. Guilliman, if he survived the initial treachery or was absent from Terra when it occurred, would immediately begin organizing a coordinated Imperial response. The Ultramarines' strength has always been in logistics and organization. They would work to prevent panic from spreading through the Imperium, to ensure that the supply lines feeding the war machine continue functioning despite the loss of central coordination from Terra. Guilliman would also recognize a terrible truth. The Custodians could not be defeated through conventional military assault, not while they held the palace, and especially not if they retained control of the Emperor. Any campaign to retake Terra would need to be carefully calculated, balancing the need for decisive action against the very real risk of killing the Emperor in the process. This would be war of the most delicate kind, where every bombardment must be precisely targeted, where every assault must account for the possibility that the Emperor's life hangs in the balance. The Blood Angels and their successor, chapters, would face their own particular anguish. The Custodians fought alongside Sanguinius during the final assault on the vengeful spirit. They witnessed his death at Horus's hands, shared in the grief of that loss. For them to now betray the Emperor that Sanguinius died protecting would feel like a desecration of their Primarch's sacrifice. The Black Rage might manifest with new ferocity among their ranks, driven by this additional betrayal to add to the psychic trauma they already carry. The Dark Angels would likely respond with grim determination, perhaps even seeing an opportunity in the crisis. The Unforgiven have spent 10,000 years hunting the fallen, their own traitor brethren from the Horus Heresy. They understand better than most what it means to have supposedly loyal warriors turn against their oaths. The Inner Circle might see parallels between the Custodians' betrayal and the fall of Luther, and in fighting to reclaim Terra, they might seek a kind of redemption for their own chapter's ancient shame. The Space Wolves, traditional skeptics of authority and independent to a fault, would face a crisis of their own. Leman Russ fought alongside Custodians during the burning of Prospero, an action he came to regret. The wolves pride themselves on being the emperor's executioners, loyal to him above all other considerations. But with the Custodians claiming they too act in the emperor's true interests, the wolves would need to decide who truly speaks for the master of mankind. Their decision might well depend on whether Russ returns from wherever he has been wandering these past 10 millennia, bringing with him clarity that only a Primarch could provide. The Grey Knights would find themselves in perhaps the most unusual position. As the Imperium's demon hunters, they operate in complete secrecy, known only to the highest echelons of Imperial authority. They were created specifically to combat chaos and the Custodians' betrayal. If not motivated by chaos corruption, would fall outside their usual mandate. Yet the Grey Knights also have closer ties to the Custodians than most realize, as both organizations served together during the war within the Webway. Some Grey Knights maintain relationships with individual Custodians that go back centuries. The personal element might complicate what should be a straightforward strategic decision. Beyond the Astartes, the broader Imperial military would face catastrophic coordination problems. The Imperial Guard operates on orders from the High Lords of Terra, transmitted through a vast bureaucratic chain of command. With the High Lords dead or besieged, with Terra itself under Custodian control, the Guard would find itself leaderless at precisely the moment it needed strong leadership. Segmentum commanders would need to make their own decisions about how to respond, leading to fragmentation and potentially contradictory orders being issued across the Imperium. The Imperial Navy would face similar problems, compounded by the fact that many of their largest vessels require specialized maintenance that can only be performed at shipyards in the Sol system. These shipyards would now be under Custodian control or within range of weapons controlled by the traitors. Attempting to retake or destroy these facilities would cripple the Navy's long-term operational capacity, but leaving them in enemy hands would give the Custodians the ability to repair and potentially even expand their own fleet. The Mechanicus would face an agonizing choice. Mars orbits within the Sol system, making it both a strategic asset and a potential target. The Fabricator General would need to decide whether to support the Imperium's efforts to retake Terra or attempt to maintain neutrality, trading with both sides while protecting the Mechanicus's own interests. Given the Mechanicus's long history of political maneuvering and self-interest, they might well choose the latter option, reasoning that the Omnissiah's faithful should survive regardless of who ultimately controls Terra. However, certain factions within the Mechanicus might see opportunity in the chaos. Radical elements have long argued that the Mechanicus should not be subservient to Terra, that the quest for knowledge should take precedence over political loyalty. If the Custodians offered the Mechanicus greater autonomy in exchange for technological support, certain Forge worlds might be tempted to ally with the rebels, seeing it as a chance to escape centuries of Imperial oversight. The Inquisition would be perhaps the most divided of all Imperial institutions. Individual Inquisitors operate with tremendous autonomy, answering to their own conscience and interpretation of duty rather than any centralized command structure. Some would immediately declare the Custodians, excommunicate Traitoris, would dedicate every resource at their disposal to destroying them. Others might see nuance in the situation, might investigate whether the Custodians have legitimate grievances or whether their betrayal serves a purpose that mortal minds cannot yet comprehend. The most radical Inquisitors might even support the rebellion. Elements of the Inquisition have long believed the Imperium is rotten to its core, that its institutions are corrupt beyond redemption. If the Custodians claimed their betrayal was motivated by a desire to reform rather than destroy, if they promised to purge the corruption and return the Imperium to its founding principles, some Inquisitors might view this as a necessary purgation, painful but ultimately beneficial. The Ecclesiarchy's response would be the simplest and most absolute. The Custodians' betrayal would be declared the highest heresy, an act of blasphemy beyond measure. Cardinals would preach in the grandest cathedrals about the fall of false angels, would draw parallels to the Horus heresy, would call for holy war to reclaim terror from the traitors. Billions of faithful would be whipped into religious fervor, forming crusading armies driven by faith rather than military discipline. These faith-driven forces would be among the most dangerous elements of the imperial response, not because of their military effectiveness, which would likely be limited, but because of their unpredictability. Custodians can predict and counter rational military tactics, can outthink conventional strategists, can anticipate logical responses to their actions. But fanatics driven by religious ecstasy, willing to die in suicidal charges, completely indifferent to their own survival. That kind of enemy presents unique challenges. As these various imperial factions organized their responses, the Custodians would not be passive. They would use their control of terror to maximum effect, leveraging the symbolic importance of the throne world to drive wedges between different imperial factions. They might release carefully edited information about the current state of the emperor, showing the suffering he endures on the golden throne, attempting to win sympathy for their stated goal of ending his torment. They might broadcast evidence of imperial corruption, documenting the countless ways the current regime has betrayed the emperor's vision, making the case that their rebellion is actually the true loyalty. The result would be not a simple binary conflict between loyalists and traitors, but a fracturing of the Imperium into multiple factions, each claiming to serve the emperor's true will, each convinced that their interpretation of his desires is correct. This fragmentation would be the Custodians' greatest weapon. Far more effective than their combat prowess alone, they do not need to defeat the Imperium militarily. They merely need to ensure it cannot unite against them long enough to achieve their objectives, whatever those might be. The Warp Watchers. In the realm of chaos, in that impossible dimension where reality and nightmare blend into indistinguishable horror, the four powers would observe the Custodians' betrayal with emotions that mortal minds can barely conceive. For 10,000 years, the Chaos Gods have sought to claim terror, to corrupt the Imperium from within, to shatter the Emperor's works, and feast upon the psychic energy of his empire's collapse. And now, without any intervention from chaos, without any corruption or manipulation, the Emperor's own perfect warriors have turned against him. Horn, the blood god, would feel something approaching satisfaction. The concept of ultimate warriors betraying their creator, of perfect loyalty transforming into perfect wrath, would resonate with everything Khorne represents. The slaughter that would follow, the battles between the Custodians and the Imperial forces attempting to retake Terra, would generate exactly the kind of violence and bloodshed that feeds the Blood God's power. Every Custodian who falls in battle, every loyalist who dies trying to breach the palace, every civilian crushed in the fighting, all of that death would strengthen Khorne. Yet Khorne would also feel frustration. The Custodians are not falling to chaos. They are not accepting the Blood God's gifts, not offering skulls for his throne or blood for his altars. Their violence, while magnificent in scale and efficiency, lacks the religious fervor that Khorne craves. They kill out of necessity and strategic calculation, not out of the pure joy of slaughter. They remain disciplined, controlled, rational. This makes them less valuable to Khorne than even a single berserker who has truly abandoned themselves to rage. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, would be both delighted and concerned. The betrayal of the Custodians represents a fundamental change in the Imperium's structure, a turning point that opens new possibilities and closes others. For a god whose very essence is change and scheming, such a massive shift in galactic politics would be intoxicating. Tzeentch would immediately begin plotting how to exploit this new configuration of power, spinning countless schemes within schemes to turn the situation to his advantage. However, Tzeentch would also recognize a significant threat. The Custodians are masters of planning and strategy themselves, and if they have turned against the Emperor, it means they have thought through the implications of their actions with a thoroughness that rivals even Tzeentch's own plots. Their rebellion was not impulsive or emotional. It was calculated, the result of careful reasoning and long deliberation. This makes them dangerous opponents in the great game, players whose moves cannot be easily predicted or countered through simple manipulation. Nurgle, grandfather of plagues, would view the situation with his characteristic ambivalence. On one hand, the Custodians' betrayal represents decay and entropy, the breaking down of old orders and the triumph of despair over hope. The fact that even the Emperor's perfect warriors can lose faith, can conclude that their long vigil has been pointless, speaks to the inevitable heat-death that Nurgle embodies. Everything rots eventually, even loyalty, even purpose, even the strongest bonds. On the other hand, Nurgle would recognize that the Custodians themselves resist decay. They do not embrace entropy or give in to despair. Even in betrayal, they maintain their discipline and purpose. They have not fallen to nihilism or hopelessness. They have simply redirected their absolute dedication toward a different goal. This makes them resistant to Nurgle's gifts, unlikely to accept the comfort of giving up, of letting go, of embracing the decay they cannot prevent. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, would have perhaps the most complex reaction. The Custodians represent perfection, the absolute pinnacle of what the Emperor's genetic craft could achieve. Their betrayal of that perfection, the breaking of bonds that should have been unbreakable, contains an element of exquisite tragedy that would appeal to Slaanesh's appreciation for beauty and corruption. The emotional intensity of Custodians choosing to betray the Emperor they were created to serve, the anguish such a choice would cause them, would generate the kind of powerful feelings that feed Slaanesh's power. Yet like the other Chaos gods, Slaanesh would find the Custodians themselves frustratingly resistant to corruption. They do not pursue excess or seek pleasure for its own sake. They remain ascetic, controlled, focused on duty, even when that duty has shifted from protecting the Emperor to whatever new purpose they have embraced. They cannot be tempted by promises of sensation or experience. They have already achieved perfection in their own way, and they see no need for the mutations and enhancements Slaanesh might offer. The question that would obsess all four Chaos gods is whether the Custodians could be corrupted after their betrayal. Conventional wisdom holds that the Custodians are essentially immune to chaos, that their genetic purity and psychic fortitude make them impossible to corrupt. But that immunity was predicated on their absolute loyalty to the Emperor. Now that loyalty has broken. Does that create an opening for chaos to exploit? The answer is almost certainly no, but for reasons the Chaos gods would find deeply frustrating. The Custodians' resistance to chaos is not purely psychological, it is genetic, woven into their very cells through the Emperor's bioalchemy. Their souls are structured in ways that make them anathema to chaos, burning with the same light that made the Emperor himself the anathema. Even in betrayal, even stripped of their loyalty to their creator, they would retain this fundamental incompatibility with the warp's powers. Moreover, the Custodians would recognize any attempt at chaos corruption for what it is, and would resist with absolute determination. They have fought demons for 10,000 years, have stood in the warp itself during the war within the webway. They know chaos's methods, its promises, its seductions. They would not be fooled by offers of power or threats of destruction. If anything, their betrayal of the Emperor might make them even more resistant to chaos, having already made the most terrible choice possible and needing no further incentive to compromise. This would create a fascinating strategic situation. The Chaos gods would want the Custodians' rebellion to succeed, because a fractured Imperium is far easier to corrupt and destroy than a unified one. The civil war that would result from the Custodians' betrayal would generate massive amounts of psychic energy from suffering, fear, and despair, all of which would strengthen the powers of chaos. Entire star systems might fall to chaos cults, while the Imperium is distracted by the conflict on Terra. At the same time, the Chaos gods would need to be careful not to appear to support the Custodians too openly. If it became apparent that Chaos was benefiting from their rebellion, it might drive the Custodians back toward reconciliation with the Imperium. The last thing Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh would want is for the threat of chaos to unite the Emperor's former servants with his current ones against a common enemy. So the Chaos Gods would need to act subtly, supporting the rebellion through indirect means, while maintaining the appearance of being as much an enemy of the traitor Custodians as of the loyalist Imperium. Demon princes and greater demons would likely be ordered to avoid direct engagement with Custodian forces when possible. The goal would be to preserve the Custodians as an ongoing threat to Imperial unity while exploiting the chaos their rebellion creates to make gains elsewhere. Why waste demon legions trying to breach the palace's defenses when those same forces could be conquering undefended systems whose garrison forces have been recalled to fight the Custodians? The most dangerous possibility from the Chaos God's perspective would be if the Custodians succeeded in their rebellion so completely that they could turn their attention to fighting chaos afterward. A reformed Imperium, led by Custodians who have proven they are willing to make the hardest choices, who are not bound by tradition or bureaucracy, who combine absolute tactical perfection with strategic vision, would be a far more dangerous enemy than the current sclerotic Imperium. This worst-case scenario would force the Chaos Gods into an uncomfortable position. They might actually need to help preserve the current Imperium against the Custodians' reformation, ensuring that the corrupt, inefficient, gradually failing empire continues to exist rather than being replaced by something more effective. The irony would be exquisite. Chaos supporting the Emperor's Imperium against the Emperor's own perfect warriors, purely because those warriors have become too dangerous to allow them to succeed. The art of war. The military aspects of a Custodian rebellion would be unlike anything the Imperium has faced before. The Horus heresy involved half the Space Marine legions turning traitor, millions of Astartes backed by Titan legions, the Dark Mechanicum, and demonic hordes. That was a war of vast armies clashing across thousands of worlds. A Custodian rebellion would be something different entirely, far smaller in scale, but potentially even more devastating in its implications. The Custodians number approximately 10,000, a force so small that it would barely register in the grand strategic calculations of galactic warfare. A single hive world might field armies numbering in the billions. A Space Marine chapter typically maintains around 1,000 battle brothers, and there are over 1,000 chapters spread across the Imperium. By raw numbers, the Custodians should be insignificant, easily overwhelmed by the sheer weight of forces the Imperium could bring to bear. But numbers tell only part of the story. A single Custodian is worth dozens of Space Marines in combat, and Space Marines themselves are already far beyond normal human soldiers. The fighting capabilities of a Custodian make them not merely superior warriors, but fundamental game changers in any engagement. They can tank hits that would kill a Terminator, move with speed that defies their size and the weight of their armor, and wield weapons with a precision that borders on supernatural. Their equipment amplifies these already terrifying capabilities. Auramite armor is not merely protective. It is a sophisticated system incorporating force field generators, auto-sensors that can track targets through walls, and power systems that can sustain the armor's functions for years without maintenance. A Custodian in full warplate is effectively a one-person weapons platform, capable of engaging targets at any range, in any environment, against any opponent. The Guardian Spear, the signature weapon of the Custodian Guard, exemplifies their combat philosophy. It combines a power blade capable of carving through tank armor with an integrated bolter that fires specialized ammunition. This dual-purpose design allows a Custodian to engage both at range and in melee without switching weapons, maintaining constant offensive pressure. In the hands of a warrior with 10,000 years of combat experience, the Guardian's Spear becomes almost impossibly lethal. But individual combat prowess, while important, would not be the Custodians' greatest military advantage. Their true strength lies in their understanding of warfare at all levels, from tactical to strategic. Each custodian is a scholar of military history. Having studied every major campaign in Imperial history, and many from before the unification of Terra, they understand not just how to fight, but how to wage war. During the war within the Webway, the Custodians proved they could function as a cohesive military force despite their individualistic nature. They established defensive positions, conducted coordinated counterattacks, and managed logistics in an environment where normal supply lines were impossible. They held the line against demonic hordes for years through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer determination. This experience would inform their approach to a rebellion against the Imperium. Their strategy would likely focus on force multiplication through superior positioning and intelligence. The Custodians do not need to defeat the Imperium's armies in the field. They merely need to make the cost of defeating them unacceptably high. By controlling Terra and potentially threatening the Emperor's safety, they would force any attacking force to fight under severe constraints, unable to use their most devastating weapons for fear of causing catastrophic collateral damage. The Imperial Palace itself would become their greatest weapon. This structure, which covers a significant portion of Terra's northern hemisphere, is not merely a fortress, but a continent-spanning defensive complex. It contains weapons systems that could engage targets in orbit, void shield generators powerful enough to withstand sustained bombardment from entire fleets, and supplies stockpiled to sustain sieges that could last decades. The Custodians would know how to use every system to maximum effect, having spent millennia maintaining and improving these defenses. But they would not simply hide behind walls and wait for the Imperium to come to them. The Custodians are also masters of offensive operations, capable of launching devastating strikes against strategic targets before withdrawing back to their fortified positions. Small teams of Custodians could be deployed throughout the Sol system and beyond, conducting raids against Imperial forces, disrupting supply lines, assassinating commanders, and generally creating chaos that would force the Imperium to spread its forces thin, trying to defend against threats that could appear anywhere. These raiding forces would be nearly impossible to counter effectively. A single Custodian strike team could infiltrate a heavily defended position, eliminate their target, and extract before effective response forces could be mobilized. They could hijack void-capable ships, using them to move between systems before abandoning them, making their movements almost impossible to track. They could pose as loyalists, using their authority to gain access to secure facilities before revealing their true allegiance at the most devastating possible moment. The psychological impact of facing Custodians in battle would be its own form of weapon. Imperial Guard regiments that have never seen a Custodian in person would suddenly find themselves facing these golden giants, these perfect warriors who move through their ranks like death itself. The terror this would inspire would break units that might have held against ordinary enemies. Even Space Marines, who fear nothing mortal, would feel profound unease at the prospect of fighting the very warriors they have been taught to revere as paragons of the Emperor's vision. This psychological warfare would be amplified by the Custodians' use of their own symbolism. They might paint their armor in colors that invoke the Emperor's own livery, might carry banners declaring that they are the true defenders of the Emperor's will. Every engagement would be an attack, not just on the enemy's physical forces, but on their morale and their faith. How do you fight with conviction against warriors claiming to be more loyal than you are, more dedicated to the Emperor than you could ever be? The Imperium's military response would need to account for all these factors, and there is no clear path to victory that does not involve unacceptable costs. A direct assault on Terra would require an invasion force numbering in the millions, possibly billions, all focused on a heavily fortified position defended by the most skilled warriors in the galaxy. The casualties would be catastrophic, even if the assault succeeded, and success would by no means be guaranteed. Orbital bombardment would be ineffective due to the void shields and would risk damage to Terra's infrastructure, possibly even to the Golden Throne itself. Virus bombing or cyclonic torpedoes, the kinds of weapons that could reduce entire planets to lifeless rocks, are completely out of the question. The Imperium cannot destroy Terra to save it. A siege would be the most logical approach, surrounding Terra and cutting it off from outside supplies, while searching for some way to break the stalemate without destroying the planet. But the Custodians would have prepared for this possibility, stockpiling supplies and establishing self-sufficient production within the palace. They could potentially hold out for years, perhaps decades, and every day the siege continues would be another day the Imperium operates without its capital, without the central coordination Terra provides. The most effective counter to the Custodians would likely be other Custodians. If some portion of the 10,000 chose to remain loyal to the Imperium, they would be the only force capable of meeting their former brothers on equal terms. A civil war within the Custodian Guard itself would be the most bitter and personal kind of conflict. Warriors who have fought together for millennia now forced to kill each other. The psychological and emotional toll of such a fraternal conflict would be immense, and the outcome uncertain. Alternatively, the Primarchs, if enough of them return, might be capable of countering Custodian forces through their own superhuman abilities. A Primarch is to a Custodian as a Custodian is to a Space Marine, a being of such transcendent capability that normal rules do not apply. But Primarchs are rare, and those who remain loyal to the current Imperium, rarer still. Relying on Primarchs to solve the problem would require first finding and awakening those who sleep, or convincing those who have already returned to commit to the fight. The grim reality is that there may be no military solution to a Custodian rebellion. If the 10,000 are truly committed to their course, if they are willing to accept any cost and make any sacrifice to achieve their goals, then the Imperium may face a choice between accepting their demands or destroying Terra. Either outcome would represent a catastrophic failure of the Imperium's fundamental order, a shattering of certainties that have endured for 10,000 years. Faith betrayed. The political and religious consequences of the Custodians' betrayal would ripple through the Imperium with devastating force, shaking the foundations of every institution and challenging every assumption about duty, loyalty, and the Emperor's will. For 10 millennia, the Imperium has rested on certain fundamental beliefs. The Emperor protects. The Emperor endures. And the Emperor's Custodians, his perfect warriors, his companions, stand eternally loyal at his side. When that final certainty shatters, when the Golden Guardians themselves reject their oaths, the psychological impact on the Imperium's population would be difficult to overstate. The Custodians are not merely military forces or political actors. They are living symbols, proof that perfection is possible, that absolute loyalty can exist, that the Emperor's vision can be made manifest in flesh and blood. Their betrayal would call into question everything the Imperium believes about itself. The ecclesiarchy would face an immediate crisis of faith. For thousands of years, the imperial cult has taught that the Emperor is divine, that he watches over humanity from the Golden Throne, that his will guides the Imperium toward its manifest destiny. The Custodians have always been held up as evidence of this divinity, as proof that the Emperor's power is so great that even his creations surpass anything ordinary humanity could achieve. Cardinals and preachers have used the Custodians as exemplars in countless sermons, holding them up as models of what true faith and devotion look like. Now those same exemplars have turned away. How does a preacher explain this to their congregation? How does the ecclesiarchy reconcile the Custodians' betrayal with their doctrine that the Emperor is omniscient and all-powerful? If the Emperor truly is a god, how did his own perfect warriors turn against him? And if he is not a god, if the Custodians are right to reject him, then what does that mean for the billions who worship him as divine? Some within the ecclesiarchy would likely declare the Custodians to be false idols, corruption wearing golden armor, perhaps even suggesting that these warriors are not the true Custodians at all, but some demonic imitation sent to test the faith of the righteous. This explanation would be comforting, but ultimately unsustainable. Too many people have seen Custodians, know what they are, understand that these are indeed the Emperor's own creation. Others might take a different approach, arguing that the Custodians' betrayal is part of some greater divine plan that mortal minds cannot comprehend. Perhaps the Emperor has commanded this, is testing his servants' faith by removing the certainty of Custodian loyalty. Perhaps this is a trial, a crucible through which the Imperium must pass to be purified. This interpretation would preserve the Emperor's divinity while explaining the seemingly inexplicable. The most dangerous response from the ecclesiarchy would be schism. Different factions within the church might come to radically different conclusions about what the Custodians' betrayal means, leading to competing interpretations of doctrine and potentially even open conflict between different branches of the imperial cult. A civil war within the ecclesiarchy would compound the military crisis on Terra, potentially fragmenting the Imperium's spiritual unity just as its political unity is being shattered. For the common citizens of the Imperium, the news would be almost incomprehensible. Most Imperial citizens will live and die without ever seeing a Custodian, without ever traveling to Terra, without ever having any direct contact with the higher levels of Imperial authority. Their understanding of the Imperium comes filtered through layers of propaganda, religious doctrine, and local tradition. The Custodians exist for them as near mythical figures, angels in gold who guard the Emperor himself. Learning that these angels have fallen, that they have turned their weapons against the throne, would shake these citizens' worldview to its foundations. Some would refuse to believe it, would dismiss the news as enemy propaganda or heretical lies. Others would lose faith entirely, would conclude that if even the Custodians can betray the Emperor, then there is no hope for anyone. The psychological damage from this loss of certainty could manifest in countless ways, from religious despair to violent unrest, to mass movements either for or against the established order. Planetary governors and system administrators would face their own crises of legitimacy. Their authority ultimately derives from the Emperor, channeled through the High Lords of Terra and the vast imperial bureaucracy. With Terra under Custodian control, with the High Lords likely dead, the chain of command that supposedly connects every governor to the Golden Throne has been severed. On what basis do they continue to rule? By what right do they demand obedience from their subjects? Some governors would seize this opportunity to declare independence, reasoning that if the Custodians themselves can reject their oaths, then lesser beings are certainly free to do the same. Other governors, more cunning, might attempt to play both sides, claiming loyalty to the Imperium while secretly negotiating with the Custodians, trying to position themselves advantageously for whatever new order emerges from the chaos. The Administratum, that vast bureaucratic machine that keeps the Imperium functioning despite its overwhelming size and complexity, would grind to a confused halt. The Administratum runs on procedure, on established protocols and chains of authority that stretch back thousands of years. When those chains are broken, when the procedures no longer clearly apply, because the people who were supposed to give the orders are dead or besieged, the entire system stops working. Requisitions for military supplies might go unfilled because the clerk responsible does not know who has the authority to approve them. Tax revenues collected by planetary governments might sit in treasuries because the normal channels for transferring them to Terra no longer function. Ship captains might wait months for permission to enter systems because the astropaths who should authorize their passage cannot reach the now inaccessible bureaus on Terra that issue such permissions. This bureaucratic paralysis would have cascading effects throughout the Imperium. Armies would run short of ammunition and supplies. Food shipments destined for hive worlds would be delayed, leading to famines. Planetary defenses would deteriorate for lack of maintenance because the replacement parts were supposed to come from Terra. The Imperium's economy, always fragile due to the vast distances involved and the unreliability of warp travel, would begin to collapse. The Inquisition would be thrown into turmoil as different inquisitors reached different conclusions about how to respond. The Ordo Hereticus, traditionally focused on hunting heretics within the Imperium, would debate whether the Custodians qualify as heretics in any conventional sense. They have not fallen to chaos, have not embraced alien gods, have not broken their oaths for selfish gain. They claim to serve the Emperor's true will, just through different methods than the current Imperium employs. The Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters, would likely conclude that while the Custodians themselves are not tainted by chaos, their rebellion creates opportunities for demonic corruption that must be contained. The Ordo Xenos would probably care less about the political implications and more about whether the disruption makes the Imperium more vulnerable to alien threats. These disagreements within the Inquisition would almost certainly lead to violent confrontations between different factions. Inquisitors who support crushing the rebellion might find themselves battling inquisitors who believe the Custodians have legitimate grievances. The Inquisition has always operated with dangerous autonomy, inquisitors investigating and sometimes executing other inquisitors. Now, this internal policing would escalate to something approaching civil war within the organization. The Space Marine chapters would grapple with questions of honor and duty that cut to the core of their identity. The Astartes were created to be the Emperor's finest warriors, his angels of death who would carry his light to the darkest corners of the galaxy. But the Custodians were created first, were meant to be even greater than the Astartes, more perfect in every way. If perfection itself can be flawed, if even the Emperor's most favored creations can fall, what does that say about the Space Marines themselves? Some chapters might respond by doubling down on their oaths, swearing new vows of loyalty to prove that they at least will never waver as the Custodians have. Others might begin to question, might wonder if the Custodians know something they do not, if their betrayal is based on information or insights that have been kept from the chapters. Still others might see the Custodians' example as license to pursue their own agendas more aggressively, reasoning that if loyalty can be conditional for the greatest warriors, it can certainly be conditional for lesser beings. The political fragmentation would be most visible in the sectors furthest from Terra. These regions have always operated with significant autonomy out of sheer necessity, the delays inherent in communicating across such vast distances making centralized control impractical. Now, with Terra in chaos and central authority effectively non-existent, these sectors would become truly independent, their only connection to the broader Imperium being tradition and the occasional visit from a Space Marine fleet. Some sector governors would attempt to form regional confederations, banding together for mutual protection and pooling resources. Others would engage in open warfare, seeing the Imperium's collapse as an opportunity to settle old scores or expand their territories. Pirates and raiders would flourish, knowing that the Imperial Navy is too busy dealing with the crisis at the core systems to patrol the fringes. Alien empires would see opportunity, launching invasions into territories that suddenly lack the usual Imperial defenses. The cumulative effect would be not a single Imperium descending into civil war, but the Imperium fragmenting into hundreds or thousands of smaller polities, each claiming to represent the Emperor's true will, each fighting against neighbors who make similar claims. This fragmentation would be far more devastating in the long term than any military defeat, because it would mean the end of humanity as a unified species. Future historians might well mark the Custodians' betrayal as the moment when the age of the Imperium ended and the age of fragmentation began. Seeking allies. In the aftermath of their rebellion, the Custodians would face a galaxy full of potential allies and enemies, with the lines between the two categories often blurred by circumstance and necessity. Their choice of whom to trust, whom to oppose, and whom to attempt to manipulate would shape the course of the civil war that their betrayal initiated. Each potential ally brings advantages and risks. Each potential enemy represents threats that must be carefully managed. The most obvious potential allies would be elements within the Imperium itself who have grown disillusioned with the current regime. There are countless officials, military officers, and even Space Marine chapters who recognize that the Imperium is failing, that its bureaucracy has become corrupt beyond redemption, that its religious oppression has replaced the Emperor's original vision of reason and enlightenment. If the Custodians framed their rebellion as an attempt at reformation rather than simple betrayal, they might find willing supporters among these disaffected elements. Reboot Guilliman, if he survived the initial crisis and chose to engage rather than attempt to remain neutral, would be a particularly valuable potential ally. The Primarch has already demonstrated his willingness to challenge imperial orthodoxy, making sweeping changes to military organization and political structure over the objections of traditionalists. He might recognize in the Custodians' actions an extreme version of his own reformist impulses, might even sympathize with their apparent goal of restoring what the Emperor originally intended. However, bringing Guilliman to the Custodians' side would require convincing him that their methods, however extreme, are justified by the circumstances. The Primarch is pragmatic, but not ruthless, willing to make hard choices, but not to abandon all principle in pursuit of victory. If the Custodians' betrayal resulted in massive civilian casualties or endangered the Emperor's life, Guilliman would likely oppose them regardless of their stated goals. Other Primarchs, should they return, would present different possibilities. The Lion, if awakened from his slumber in the rock, might view the situation through a lens of loyalty versus disloyalty that leaves little room for nuance. He would likely side with whoever he concludes truly serves the Emperor's interests, making no distinction between legitimate authority and effective authority. The Khan, if he could be found in the webway where he is rumored to wander, might sympathize with the Custodians' apparent decision to follow their own judgment rather than blindly obeying institutions they view as corrupt. Leman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, would present perhaps the most dangerous variable. The Space Wolves have always prided themselves on being the Emperor's most loyal servants, willing to undertake the darkest duties for his sake. Russ himself led the attack on Prospero that destroyed the Thousand Suns, an action he later came to regret, but which demonstrated his willingness to follow orders even when they troubled his conscience. If Russ concluded that the Custodians had genuinely betrayed the Emperor, he would pursue them with the same relentless determination he once brought against Magnus. But if he could be convinced that they act in the Emperor's true interests, the Wolves might become their most valuable allies. The Mechanicus represents a potential alliance built on mutual need rather than ideological alignment. The Adeptus Mechanicus has long chafed under imperial authority, viewing itself as a separate entity that cooperates with Terra out of convenience rather than subordination. If the Custodians offered the Mechanicus greater autonomy, perhaps even freedom to pursue forbidden technologies without inquisitorial oversight, certain Forge worlds might be willing to provide technological support for the rebellion. However, such an alliance would be dangerous for both parties. The Mechanicus' pursuit of knowledge has frequently led them into areas that border on tech heresy, and some Forge worlds have fallen to chaos corruption through their experiments with archaeotech and xenotech. The Custodians would need to carefully monitor any Mechanicus allies to ensure they do not introduce corrupting influences. At the same time, the Mechanicus would need to consider whether short-term autonomy is worth the long-term risk of backing a rebellion that might fail. The most controversial potential allies would be those outside the Imperium entirely. Certain factions of Eldar, particularly the craft world Eldari, might view the Custodians' rebellion as an opportunity to weaken humanity in preparation for Eldar resurgence. However, the Eldar are also pragmatic enough to recognize that a complete collapse of the Imperium would likely benefit Chaos more than themselves. They might offer limited support to the Custodians, providing intelligence or even military aid in specific situations, while carefully ensuring they do not become so invested in the conflict that they cannot withdraw when convenient. The Tau Empire, always eager to expand its sphere of influence, might approach the Custodians with offers of alliance based on the greater good philosophy. They could argue that the Imperium's authoritarian structure is fundamentally flawed, that the Custodians' rebellion proves the need for a new social order based on cooperation rather than domination. The Tau might offer technology, supplies, even military support in exchange for the Custodians agreeing to allow Tau expansion into former Imperial territories. Such an alliance would be treasonous in the eyes of most Imperial citizens, confirmation that the Custodians have truly fallen beyond redemption. Working with Xenos, especially Xenos, who explicitly seek to supplant humanity's dominance, would undermine any claim the Custodians make about serving humanity's interests. Yet if the alternative is defeat and execution, if cooperation with aliens is the only path to achieving their goals, the Custodians might decide that pragmatism outweighs principle. The Custodians' enemies would be numerous and implacable. The ecclesiarchy would mobilize billions of faithful in crusades to retake Terra, viewing the conflict as a holy war against ultimate blasphemy. These crusading armies would be poorly equipped and badly organized compared to professional military forces, but their sheer numbers and fanatical determination would make them dangerous. More problematically, they would be nearly impossible to negotiate with. You cannot reason with someone who believes they fight for their god's honor. Space Marine chapters, loyal to the current Imperium, would represent the most dangerous military threat. Chapters like the Imperial Fists, Black Templars, and Ultramarines have the training, equipment, and determination necessary to seriously threaten even Custodian forces. A coordinated assault by multiple chapters, supported by Imperial Navy assets and Guard regiments, could potentially overwhelm the Custodians' defenses through sheer weight of numbers, if not through superior skill. The Inquisition would pursue the Custodians with obsessive dedication. Individual Inquisitors, each with their own networks of agents and resources, would hunt for weaknesses to exploit, for ways to turn the Custodians against each other, for any leverage that might end the rebellion without requiring a catastrophic military assault on Terra. Some Inquisitors might attempt infiltration, trying to place spies within the Custodian forces or suborning servants within the palace. Others might pursue more exotic methods, seeking forbidden knowledge or Xenos technology that could provide an edge. Assassins from the Officio Assassinorum would be deployed against Custodian commanders and key figures in their alliance network. These operatives, trained in methods of killing that border on the supernatural, would represent a constant threat that the Custodians would need to defend against. A Kalidas assassin could potentially infiltrate Custodian ranks by mimicking their appearance. A Culexus assassin's anti-psyker abilities might allow them to approach the Golden Throne despite the psychic defenses that normally protect it. An Eversaw might be deployed in a suicide attack against a critical facility, accepting certain death in exchange for devastating damage. The Chaos Forces would nominally be enemies of both the Custodians and the Imperium, but their actual behavior would be far more complex. Certain Chaos warbands might attack Custodian positions, seeing them as worthy opponents or seeking to claim the prestige of defeating the Emperor's perfect warriors. Others might focus on Imperial forces, reasoning that attacking the Traditionalists weakens the overall defense of humanity. Still others might attempt to play both sides against each other, providing covert support to whichever faction seems weaker at any given moment to prolong the conflict and maximize the bloodshed and suffering. The Tyranids, Orcs, and Necrons would be largely indifferent to the political implications of the Custodians' rebellion, responding only to the tactical opportunities it creates. Tyranid hive fleets might redirect towards systems whose defenses have been weakened by the recall of garrison forces to fight the civil war. Greenskins would launch attacks into territories that previously seemed too well defended to be worth the effort. Necron tomb worlds might awaken to find their traditional enemies distracted and vulnerable. Navigating this complex web of alliances and enmities would require all of the Custodians' considerable diplomatic skill. They would need to forge temporary partnerships with forces they despise, make promises they may not be able to keep, and constantly reassess their strategic position as new actors enter the conflict and old allies prove unreliable. The challenge would not be merely military, but political, requiring the Custodians to prove they are as skilled at statecraft as they are at war. The Emperor's silence. At the heart of all these political, military, and religious upheavals lies a single question that overshadows everything else. What happens to the Emperor? For 10,000 years, he has sat upon the golden throne, his broken body sustained by archaeotech life support and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. His mind, fractured and diffused across the Imperium, maintains the Astronomicon and holds shut the seals keeping demonic forces from pouring through the broken webway gate beneath the palace. He is simultaneously the Imperium's greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability. The Custodians' betrayal immediately calls into question the Emperor's safety, and by extension, the safety of everyone in the Imperium who depends on his continued existence. If the Custodians control the palace, they control access to the Golden Throne. They could theoretically do anything to him, from attempting to heal him to choosing to end his millennia of suffering. The possibilities are terrifying, and none of them are acceptable to the billions who worship him as the God Emperor. One scenario has the Custodians attempting to shut down the Golden Throne, believing that allowing the Emperor to finally die would be an act of mercy. They might reason that he has suffered enough, that 10,000 years of tortured half-existence is too high a price to pay, even for the Astronomicon and the sealed webway gate. They might believe that the Emperor himself would choose death if he could communicate clearly, that the being who once led the Great Crusade would prefer oblivion to this eternal imprisonment. The consequences of such an action would be immediate and apocalyptic. The Astronomicon would fail the instant the Emperor's psychic presence leaves the warp, plunging the Imperium into navigational darkness. Warp travel beyond short. Dangerous jumps would become impossible. The Imperium, which spans 1 million worlds across the galaxy, would fragment into isolated pockets, unable to communicate or coordinate with each other. Forge worlds could not send their products to distant sectors. Agricultural worlds could not ship food to hive worlds. The entire economy would collapse within weeks. Worse still, the psychic seals holding back the demonic forces in the webway would fail. The gate beneath the palace would burst open, and horrors beyond counting would pour into the heart of Terra itself. The entire planet might be consumed by a warp rift, becoming a second eye of Terra at the very center of the Imperium. The psychic shockwave from the Emperor's death would ripple through the entire galaxy, potentially creating new warp storms and making even short-range warp travel lethally dangerous. Some have theorized that the Emperor's death might lead to his rebirth, that like the perpetual he is said to be, he might regenerate after death and return more powerful than before. But this is speculation built on hope rather than evidence. Even if it is true, the period between death and resurrection could last years, decades, perhaps centuries. The Imperium would not survive the interim. Without the Emperor's presence in the warp, without the Astronomicon to guide ships, without his seals holding back the demons, humanity would be overwhelmed by its enemies long before any theoretical resurrection could occur. An alternative scenario has the Custodians attempting to strengthen the Golden Throne rather than shut it down, perhaps even trying to wake the Emperor from his millennia-long stupor. This would require accessing technology and knowledge that has been lost for thousands of years, potentially even attempting to repair or replace parts of the throne itself. The Mechanicus has periodically tried such repairs with disastrous results, their efforts more often damaging the ancient mechanisms than improving them. The Custodians, with their deeper understanding of the Emperor's works and access to forbidden knowledge stored in the palace's vaults, might have better success. But they might also trigger a catastrophic failure that achieves the same result as deliberately shutting the throne down. If the Custodians could successfully stabilize the Golden Throne, perhaps even improve its efficiency, or reduce the number of psychers required to maintain it. The political implications would be profound. They could claim to have succeeded where 10,000 years of Mechanicus efforts have failed, could present themselves as the Emperor's true servants while portraying the Adeptus Mechanicus and other imperial institutions as incompetent at best, actively harmful at worst. This might win them support from those who desperately want to believe that the Imperium can be reformed, that the current stagnation and decay can be reversed. More radically, the Custodians might attempt to communicate with the Emperor himself, to bypass the throne's limitations and speak directly to whatever remains of his consciousness. There are precedents for this. The Emperor has occasionally communicated with individuals through visions or dreams, has manifested in the warp as a being of golden light to guide or warn his servants. But these communications have been rare and often cryptic, leaving their recipients uncertain whether they truly spoke with the Emperor or merely experienced hallucinations or warp phenomena. If the Custodians could establish clear, reliable communication with the Emperor, they could claim direct divine mandate for their actions. No one could challenge their authority if they can demonstrate that the Emperor himself supports their rebellion. But attempting such communication would be extraordinarily dangerous. The Emperor's mind is not wholly present in his body. Much of his consciousness exists in the warp, where it battles demons and maintains the Astronomicon. Trying to contact him there would mean projecting one's awareness into the most hostile environment imaginable, where thoughts become reality and demons hunger for any soul that enters their domain. Another possibility is that the Custodians take no direct action regarding the Emperor, but simply maintain the status quo while using their control of the palace to dictate terms to the broader Imperium. They might continue feeding psychers to the Golden Throne, continue maintaining the Astronomicon, continue performing all the functions they have always performed. But now they would do so while demanding reforms to the Imperium's structure, threatening to stop maintaining the throne if their demands are not met. This scenario would place the Imperium in an impossible position. Meeting the Custodians' demands would mean accepting that traitors can dictate policy to the entire Imperium, setting a precedent that would undermine all authority structures. But refusing their demands while they control the Golden Throne would risk them carrying out their threats, which could lead to the same catastrophic results as if they had immediately shut down the throne. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that the Emperor might actually support the Custodians' rebellion. What if his fractured consciousness has been trying to communicate his will for millennia, trying to tell his servants that the Imperium has gone horribly wrong, but his messages have been ignored or misinterpreted? What if the Custodians' betrayal is actually the culmination of a plan he has been subtly guiding for thousands of years, bringing about circumstances that would finally allow him to communicate clearly through actions rather than vague visions? This possibility would vindicate the Custodians while condemning the entire structure of the Imperium. It would mean that the Ecclesiarchy's religion, the High Lord's governance, the Inquisition's methods, all of it has been a betrayal of what the Emperor actually wanted. It would mean that billions have died in service to a regime that their god opposed, that countless atrocities have been committed in the name of an emperor who never desired such things. The psychological impact of such a revelation would shatter the Imperium more completely than any military defeat. Regardless of what happens to the Emperor himself, his symbolic importance would remain central to the conflict. Both sides would claim to represent his true will. Both would argue that their actions serve his interests and humanity's survival. The Custodians might point to the Emperor's original vision of an enlightened secular humanity freed from superstition. Their opponents might cite the current reality of the Imperium, arguing that the Emperor's vision proved unworkable and that the religious Imperium that has endured for 10,000 years must therefore have his tacit approval. The inability to determine what the Emperor actually wants, to know his mind on the matter, would be the most frustrating aspect of the entire conflict. He sits upon the Golden Throne, unable to speak clearly, unable to judge between the competing claims made in his name. His silence forces everyone else to interpret, to guess, to project their own beliefs and desires onto him. And in the absence of clear divine guidance, everyone must simply do what they believe is right, and hope that when the emperor finally does speak, assuming he ever can, he will approve of their choices. The galaxy transformed. As the conflict between the Custodians and the Imperium drags on, the long-term consequences would begin to reshape the entire galaxy in ways that make the initial betrayal seem almost small in comparison. The Imperium, as it has existed for 10,000 years, would be fundamentally altered, possibly destroyed entirely, replaced by something new and uncertain. The nature of that transformation would depend on how the conflict ultimately resolves, or if it resolves at all. In a scenario where the Custodians achieve their objectives and successfully reform the Imperium, the changes would be revolutionary. The ecclesiarchy would likely be stripped of political power, its cathedrals converted to secular purposes, its priests either retrained as educators teaching reason and science, or simply disbanded. The worship of the emperor as a god would be suppressed, replaced by a return to the imperial truth, the secular ideology that guided the Great Crusade. This would be traumatic for the billions who have known nothing but faith in the god emperor, many of whom would resist such changes violently. The High Lords of Terror would be replaced by a new governing structure, possibly one led directly by the Custodians themselves or by individuals they trust to implement their vision. The bureaucratic bloat that has characterized the administratum for millennia would be ruthlessly cut away, with entire departments eliminated and their functions streamlined or automated. This would improve efficiency, but would also throw millions out of work, creating social instability across Terra and countless other worlds. The Space Marine chapters might be reorganized along different lines, possibly even return to the Legion structure that existed before the second founding broke the legions into smaller chapters. The Custodians might argue that the fragmentation of military power was a mistake, that unified legions under Primarch leadership would be more effective at defending humanity. This would give returned Primarchs, like Guilliman, direct command over tens of thousands of Astartes, rather than the current system where they must negotiate with independent chapter masters. Relations with the Mechanicus would need to be fundamentally restructured. The current arrangement, where Mars maintains nominal independence while being economically dependent on the Imperium, has created perverse incentives that discourage innovation and promote hoarding of knowledge. A reformed Imperium might grant the Mechanicus true independence in exchange for abandoning the most restrictive aspects of their technology taboos, allowing regulated experimentation with artificial intelligence and other currently forbidden technologies. The Inquisition would face existential questions about its continued existence. In a more rational, less superstitious Imperium, the Inquisition's methods of torture, summary execution, and planetary destruction might be considered excessive. The organization might be reformed into something more like an interstellar police force, maintaining order and investigating genuine threats, but operating under legal constraints, rather than as judge, jury, and executioner accountable to no one. However, this optimistic scenario assumes the Custodians can actually implement such sweeping reforms while maintaining stability. The more likely outcome is that their revolution triggers a period of chaos that leaves the Imperium weaker and more fragmented than before. Different sectors might respond to the reforms in different ways, some embracing them, others rejecting them, leading to a patchwork galaxy where the Imperium exists only in name, its territories following wildly different political and religious systems. In a scenario where the Imperium successfully crushes the Custodian rebellion, the consequences would be almost as severe. The Custodians' betrayal would be held up as the ultimate example of why vigilance against heresy is necessary, why deviation from orthodoxy cannot be tolerated, why even the most trusted servants must be watched for signs of corruption. The Imperium would become even more oppressive, even more paranoid, even more willing to sacrifice freedom for security. New organizations might be created specifically to monitor for signs of custodian-like betrayal, watching for philosophical deviations, or questioning of established doctrine among the Imperium's elite forces. The Custodians themselves, if any survived, would be disbanded or restructured so completely that they become something entirely new. The position they held as the Emperor's companions and the defenders of the palace would need to be filled by some other force, possibly an expansion of the Imperial Fist's role or the creation of a new organization built from scratch. The religious aspects of the Imperial cult would likely intensify. If the Custodians' stated reason for betrayal was that they rejected the Emperor's deification, then proving the rightness of worshipping him as a god would become even more important to the faithful. Cardinals might preach that the Custodians fell specifically because they refused to accept the Emperor's divinity, that their pride led them into rebellion. This would make the ecclesiarchy even more powerful and even more intolerant of secular thought. A third possibility is that the conflict does not truly resolve at all, that it becomes a frozen war where neither side can achieve victory. The Custodians hold Terra and the Imperial Palace, making them impossible to dislodge without unacceptable costs. The Imperium controls most of the rest of the galaxy, giving it overwhelming numerical superiority, but no clear path to deploying that advantage. Both sides dig in, the Custodians fortifying Terra, while the Imperium establishes alternative centers of power on other worlds. In this scenario, the galaxy would gradually adjust to having two competing centers of authority, both claiming to represent the Emperor's will. Some systems would align with Terra and the Custodians, others with the alternative power centers established by the traditional Imperium. Trade would continue between these aligned systems, but crossing from one sphere of influence to another would become dangerous and complicated. Humanity would be effectively split into multiple competing empires, united only by common threats from aliens and chaos. This fragmentation would make humanity far more vulnerable to external threats. The Tyrannid hive fleets would find a fractured Imperium much easier to consume, able to devour isolated sectors while other regions lack the coordination to organize effective relief efforts. The Necrons awakening tomb worlds would face less resistance as they attempt to reclaim the galaxy. The Chaos forces would have more opportunities for corruption and conquest, finding weak points in the fragmented defenses that would have been covered in a unified Imperium. Yet fragmentation might also bring unexpected benefits. Smaller polities would be forced to be more efficient, more innovative, less bound by the sclerotic bureaucracy that has characterized the Imperium for so long. Some regions might achieve technological advancement not seen since the Dark Age of technology, freed from the Mechanicus's innovation-stifling restrictions. Others might forge alliances with Xeno's species, setting aside humanity's traditional xenophobia in favor of pragmatic cooperation against common threats. The Chaos Gods would watch these developments with satisfaction. Whether the Custodians succeed, the Imperium triumphs, or the conflict creates permanent fragmentation, all of these outcomes weaken humanity's unified resistance to chaos. The suffering generated by the Civil War would feed the dark powers. The despair as the Imperium fractures would strengthen Nurgle. The violence and bloodshed would empower Horn, the countless betrayals and schemes would please Tzeentch, and the emotional intensity of faith either vindicated or shattered would feed Slaanesh. In the longest term, assuming humanity survives the immediate crisis, the Custodians' betrayal would become part of historical mythology, taught to future generations as a cautionary tale, or celebrated as a necessary revolution, depending on which faction controlled the narrative. Children on Imperial worlds might learn about the Golden Guard's fall as the ultimate betrayal, while children in Custodian-aligned territories might be taught about the liberation of Terra when the Emperor's true servants finally freed him from corrupt institutions. Regardless of the specific outcome, one thing seems certain: the galaxy that emerges from the Custodians' betrayal would look fundamentally different than the galaxy that existed before. Old certainties would be shattered, new alliances formed, ancient institutions either destroyed or so thoroughly reformed as to be unrecognizable. The age of the Imperium, that 10,000-year period of relative stability under the God Emperor's rule, would end, replaced by something new and uncertain. Perhaps this transformation is what the Custodians intended all along. Perhaps they looked at the stagnation and decay of the current Imperium and concluded that only radical change could save humanity. Or perhaps their betrayal was simply the product of specific circumstances, a tragedy born of impossible choices rather than a calculated revolution. Whatever their intentions, the consequences of their actions would echo through the millennia to come, shaping the future of an entire species. Conclusion. The scenario we have explored, the betrayal of the Adeptus Custodes, represents perhaps the most devastating crisis the Imperium could face, short of the Emperor's actual death. These warriors, genetically perfect and conditioned from infancy for absolute loyalty, turning against the very being they were created to serve, would shatter every assumption about duty, honor, and the nature of loyalty itself. We have seen how such a betrayal might occur, not through chaos, corruption, or external manipulation, but through the Custodians' own philosophical conclusions about what truly serves the Emperor's interests. We have examined the immediate military consequences, the catastrophic political fallout, and the long-term transformation of the galaxy that would result from such an unprecedented crisis. The Custodians' betrayal would be unlike the Horus heresy in crucial ways. It would not be a conflict born of pride or ambition, not a story of sons rebelling against their father. Instead, it would be a tragedy of perfection finding itself imperfect, of loyalty discovering that absolute dedication can lead to impossible choices, of warriors created to never question being forced by circumstance to question everything. In the grim darkness of the far future, we are told there is only war. But perhaps the greatest war is not between armies and fleets, but between competing visions of what loyalty means, what duty requires, what serving the Emperor actually entails. The Custodians' hypothetical betrayal forces us to consider these questions, to acknowledge that even in a universe of absolute moral certainty, the right path is not always clear. We can only hope that such a catastrophe never comes to pass, that the Golden Guardians maintain their eternal vigil, that the 10,000 remain forever loyal to the Master of mankind. But in contemplating this nightmare scenario, we gain a deeper understanding of what makes the Custodians so essential to the Imperium, and what would be lost if they ever truly fell. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the darkest what-if scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40k content. Until next time, may the Emperor protect, and may his Custodians stand forever loyal at his side.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.